You're listening to the For I Will Be With You podcast. For I Will Be With You. Daily reflections on recovery from the Bible.
Welcome back to the For I Will Be With You podcast. My name is Baruch. I'm an alcoholic, and I'll be your host. This is the podcast for the 9th week of the year, from February 26th to March 3rd, covering Genesis 37:4 to Genesis 39:12. So, Genesis 37:4, we're presented with the story of Joseph. And Joseph is a fairly well-known character from the Bible. There's even a Broadway musical about him called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And one of the reasons he's famous is that he was the first child of Rachel and Jacob, and he was the favorite. He was Jacob's favorite son, which caused a lot of resentment from his older brothers. And one of the reasons also, as we saw with the Broadway show, is that Jacob made him sort of the boss of everybody and gave him this special coat, which would signify him being the leader of the brothers, even though he was younger. So they resented him greatly, and this is explained in Genesis 37:4 when it said his, meaning Joseph's brothers, saw that it was he whom their father loved most of all. His brothers so hated him, and they could not speak to him peaceably. They could barely even talk to him. They hated him so much. And this makes perfect sense, and I think that we've all experienced this kind of feeling of. It is a terrible feeling to feel like a parent likes your brother or sister more than he likes you or favors him. And you have to wonder how someone at the level of Jacob, such a wise person, would do something so unwise as to openly favor one child over another. But the verse shows the full venomous power of resentment and how it can warp a life. And as addicts and alcoholics, we've probably struggled to cope with resentments throughout our lives. But when we work the steps and take inventory of our defects of characters, that unresolved resentments have been fueling our addictive behavior. While it might not be apparent to us, when we dig under the surface, we may see that we drank or used drugs because we couldn't manage the resentments we felt towards others. It became easier to anesthetize ourselves and avoid dealing with resentments like you might have over a favored sibling or a remote parent, a raise you never got, that kind of thing. It's easier sometimes for us, it was easier just to get high than to deal with the problems that led to these things, or to try and get rid of these toxic emotions. And, there's a saying in the rooms that I like to tell over, which is having a resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. The other person doesn't even really know sometimes that you have a resentment. It's really about you and how you deal with the feelings. And now the story continues in Genesis 37:9. Joseph has a dream that he feels the need to tell his brothers about. It says in Genesis 37:9, Joseph, he dreamt another dream and related it to his brothers. And he said, "Look, I dreamt another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." Now, what this has been interpreted to mean symbolically, Joseph had 11 brothers. So the 11 stars bowing down to him represent the 11 brothers, and the sun and the moon represent his mother and his father. So Joseph is saying, and he's the youngest child, or second youngest child rather, Benjamin is younger than him, but he's the youngest kid, and certainly he's been made into the boss and given the special coat. So everybody really hates him, and he just makes it worse, really, it seems, by taunting his brothers because believe me, they get the symbolism, the 11 stars bowing down to him. That's the 11 brothers. And he shows even more nerve by suggesting that his parents are going to bow down to him, the sun and the moon. So he's got, you might say Joseph has like an ego problem. He's sort of out of control here. Why does he persist in this behavior? He knows that he's hated already. And there's a whole other level to this story. I think the Joseph story is a great example of biblical interpretation where you have to look beneath the surface of the story to get the proper meaning, or at least a more full meaning of what's going on. Because there's a prophecy. The prophecy that was given to Abraham is that Israel will go down into Egypt at a later date. This is the prophecy. Somehow this prophecy has to get fulfilled. So if you understand that the prophecy is that the nation of Israel, that this family basically must go down to Egypt, then events have to occur which will get them to go down to Egypt. So by making his brothers hate him so much, Joseph is in a way setting the stage for the fulfillment of this prophecy. He's going to get sold down into slavery into Egypt and begin the process of Israel being in captivity in Egypt, which has been prophesied. So in recovery, we can take a lesson from this episode that events occur for a reason, even though we don't understand them at the time. The unpleasantness of these interchanges between Joseph and his brothers seem almost gratuitous. Why does Joseph have to mention another dream? He's already angered them. But he's got one interpretation is he has to make them angry enough to sell him into slavery, which is a key step towards him becoming the viceroy of Egypt later on, saving the world from the famine, and enabling the Israelites to settle in the land of Goshen. So he's participating in the fulfillment of a prophecy. That's one way of looking at it. So we fast forward to Genesis 37:15, and it's a little bit later on, and Joseph is the boss. He's the foreman, you might say, of this family sheep herding business that they've got. And like most shepherds, his brothers have taken the flocks and wandered off, wherever. I guess when you're a shepherd, you go where the grass is, and that might mean going miles and miles away from home. So his brothers are not around. Jacob says to Joseph, go find your brothers and check up on them, basically. Joseph at this time is about 17 years old. So he heads off in his special multicolored coat, looking for his brothers, and he can't find them. It says in Genesis 37:15, and a certain man found him, Joseph, and behold, he, Joseph, was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where are they feeding the flock? His brethren, his brothers. So this is an interesting little moment. Commentary on the Torah tells us that this man that Joseph ran into is actually the angel Gabriel, who is sent to direct Joseph towards his brothers. So he didn't know where they were, and he couldn't find them. And he must have understood at this point that he was going into a dangerous situation, if not a deadly situation. I mean, everybody in this story was pretty aware of where things stood. But what's interesting is that Joseph takes a direction from this man and goes to find his brothers immediately. Unlike, I think, many of us, I know I've been in this position where you're sent on a job that you really don't want to do. And you find an excuse not to do it. Oh, I couldn't find my brothers. It would be so easy for Joseph just to go back home and say to his father, I'm so sorry. I looked all over the place and I couldn't find them. Sorry. Instead, he makes an effort to find them, and he does find them. And when he finds them, they try to kill him. Right? So Joseph is on a high level spiritually. He understood that the request from his father had to be honored, even if it meant walking into an ambush. And this is like in recovery where we have setbacks that offer us opportunities to shirk our responsibilities for ourselves and others. It's like, oh, I couldn't get a cab, so I missed the meeting. I mean, that's like a mild version of it. Or, it was cold out, so I didn't go see someone I was supposed to see. But Joseph doesn't take a free pass to do nothing when he should be taking action. So we can try and be maybe more like Joseph. Take the required action, even if the consequences are potentially challenging. Now, in Genesis 37:20, we have what you might call in the movies a cross cut. You cut over to the brothers who are having a little family meeting amongst themselves. 37:20, the brothers say, one of them says, "Come now, therefore, let us slay him and cast him into one of the pits." A little side note, in this part of the world at that time, there were a lot of pits. People dug pits to store food and water and things like that. So there were a lot of basically wells or holes in the ground in this area. And they said, the brothers thought, we'll kill him and we'll throw him in the pit. But this is a really puzzling moment in the Bible, because you're not just dealing with any old people here. These are Jacob's sons. These are people who are considered by tradition to be some of the most brilliant, righteous people who ever lived, great experts in Torah, wisdom. And why are they doing this? It seems hard to believe that people of this caliber would, commit an act of violence out of resentment. It seems like really beneath them. And so, again, we got to go beneath the surface. And what the commentators say is that the brothers were acting. The brothers also had great powers of prophecy, and they understood that the future of this family was the future of the Israelite nation and the future of the entire Judeo-Christian monotheistic tradition. So they had what they felt was a very important decision to make, because they thought that Joseph was unsuited to lead such an important family. They felt that by killing him, they were doing something that God wanted. So this is very powerful stuff. It's not like a bunch of brothers who were angry and resentful. In fact, what the commentators say is they sat down and had a very serious, deliberate conversation and actually formed what's called in Hebrew a beis din, a rabbinical court, to sentence Joseph to death according to Torah law. So totally, the story is taking place on another level. But they were human beings, and they made a mistake. They made a couple of very serious mistakes. One of which is that they really got to feel they were doing the right thing, to the point that it blinded them to the fact that they were doing something wrong. And what's evident about it is that because they felt so empowered to do, quote unquote, the right thing, they didn't feel any remorse. Killed their brother, then they sold him into slavery, which was basically the same thing as killing him, and let their father grieve for many, many years and didn't say a word about it. And I think that we can take a hint from this story in recovery, because there are times in recovery and life in general where we really feel, oh, we are doing the right thing. This is the right thing to do. We just know that it's the right thing to do. And sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. And I think that being circumspect is one of the requirements of the program. And I think that certainly in a decision this important, you owe it to yourself to give it a review before you take action. And certainly this is one of the issues, one of the reasons for the sponsor relationship, that, especially early recovery, you just get an idea, well, I'm going to do this. This is what I must do. It's necessary. Sometimes if you review it with your sponsor, you might get a little perspective, maybe you need to wait, think it through a little bit, don't jump into things. And another angle on this is that the brothers believed they were doing God's will. Now, in a funny way they were, because they were fulfilling God's prophecy, but not in the way they thought they were. They were fulfilling God's prophecy that the Israelites should go down to Egypt and become slaves to Pharaoh. They thought they were fulfilling God's will by getting rid of an unsuitable leader for the Israelite nation. But I think that when we feel like we understand God's will for us, that's a really good signal that we need to check our reasoning, because nobody can know God's will for us. We might begin to understand it as we review events, or we might get insights into it, but when someone says, I 100% know for sure what God's will is for me and I'm going to do it, that I would say is a person who hasn't thought things through very, very well. Now, in Genesis 37:25, we have the moment where they've decided not to kill Joseph, and they throw him in the pit. It says, the brothers, and they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and laudanum, going to carry it down to Egypt. So this is the caravan of Ishmaelites, of Arabs, who the brothers are going to sell Joseph to. They're going to sell him into slavery instead of killing him. Now, why does the Bible take the time to tell us that this caravan had spices on it? There's a general theory of the Bible and Torah that the Bible doesn't waste words. There are no extraneous details in the Bible. It's not like regular writing where you add a detail like, there were spices on the caravan to make it sound interesting. If the word is in the text in the Bible, it's there for a reason. The commentary says that the caravans of this time usually carried things that didn't smell good. In fact, they carried oil, naphtha, or tar, which is still very prevalent in that part of the world. But at that time, they were carrying the surface oil that bubbled up to the surface. It was like tar, smelled terrible. But Joseph, for some reason, when he goes to Egypt, he travels in a caravan that smells of spices and sweet things. So one way to look at this is that God is being merciful to Joseph in a small way. He's sparing Joseph from the worst possible experience. It's like, okay, you're going to be a slave. Your life is basically over, but I'm going to make the ride smell a little sweeter. In fact, another interpretation of this is that this was God signaling to Joseph that this was part of God's plan by saying, I'm making this caravan smell nice. It's like a hint that this journey you're taking is for a good reason and not just the end of your life, and that you're here, you're going down to Egypt for a reason. You have a purpose to fulfill there. And I think in recovery, if we look back on our experience of addiction, we might see times when God has lightened our load a little bit like this, maybe spared us the absolute worst of an experience, helping us in little ways when we couldn't help ourselves. And I think it's good to try and see where God has helped us like that in our lives, and maybe suggested to us that we too have a higher purpose that we couldn't see at the time. So Joseph goes down to Egypt, and he is sold into slavery. He's bought by a man named Potiphar, who was an official in the court of Pharaoh, very important man, very rich man. And one of the just things to know, the commentators say that Joseph was unbelievably handsome. He was, like handsome beyond words. And he was a young man. He was only 17 years old. So we have this lady, the wife of Potiphar, another famous character in the Bible, who has Joseph, this handsome young slave, living in her house. And Egypt was a morally depraved society where things like sexual immorality were not frowned upon at all. So of course, this lady got it in her mind that she was going to, have sex with Joseph. So she schemes to make this happen, and he doesn't want to do it. He thinks it's wrong, and he believes that he is on a path that's purpose. This is one of the interesting things about Joseph. he, even though he was in this depraved society, he's been sold into slavery by his brothers, he never gives up his faith in God or his sense that he has a holy purpose in life. So it says in Genesis 39:12, she comes after him and says, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled. So what you have to picture, he's wearing some kind of like robe or something. She grabs it and he runs and it tears off and he just keeps running and she's left holding this cloak, a garment in her hand. So it's kind of almost like a funny scene, although it leads to bad consequences for him. But he ran away so quickly that he left the clothing in her hand. So you ask, why did he take an extra 2 seconds and grab his garment back and put it back on instead of running outside naked? Because what happens is he runs outside naked. She says, "This slave tried to rape me," and he's thrown into jail for 10 years. So that was a pretty big 2 seconds that Joseph seemingly wasted there. He could have saved himself a lot of aggravation. But there is a message in this, as in so many parts of the Torah. The message is that we have to run away from temptation like this, because, if we wait even for another second, we can talk ourselves into, maybe this was a good idea, and it probably isn't. And I think a lot of us have had this experience. If we just taken an extra minute maybe to think through what we were about to do at certain times in our drinking and using careers, we might have saved ourselves a lot of aggravation. And I think I can think of a few people where it really could have saved someone's life and didn't. And I think one thing in recovery that's very difficult to deal with is people, and I've done this, sort of flirt with our addictions, deliberately kind of go into things that we know are not healthy emotionally and kind of turn ourselves on, so to speak, with the idea that we're going to get back into using and somehow it won't matter anymore. We'll be able to handle it, But Joseph gives us a good model to emulate. If you're in that situation, you just run for it. It doesn't matter what happens later. Just make yourself safe and don't take an extra second.
You've been listening to the For I Will Be With You podcast. Daily reflections on recovery from the Bible. www.foriwillbewithyou.com